Welcome to the new video seminary. Here is Dr. Hoffman. Subscribe and give me likes. Let's start now. In previous lessons, we developed several different models of international trade, each of which makes different assumptions about the determinants of production possibilities. To bring out important points, each of these models leaves out aspects of reality that the others stress. These models are: the Ricardian model, production possibilities are determined by the allocation of a single resource, labor, between sectors. So again, the Ricardian model, production possibilities are determined by the allocation of a single resource, labor, between sectors. This model conveys the essential idea of comparative advantage, but doesn't allow us to talk about the distribution of income. The specific factors model. This model includes multiple factors of production, but some are specific to the sectors in which they are employed. It also captures the short-run consequences of trade and the distribution of income. And the third one, Tech-Schollin model. The multiple factors of production in this model can move across sectors. Differences in resources, the availability of those factors at the country level drive trade patterns. This model also captures the long-run consequences of trade and on the distribution of income. When we analyze real problems, we want to base our insights on a mixture of these models. For example, in the last 2 decades, one of the central changes in the world trade was the rapid growth in exports from newly industrializing economies. These countries experienced rapid productivity growth. To discuss the implications of this productivity growth, we may want to apply the Ricardian model. The changing pattern of trade has differential effects of different groups in real states, for example, in the United States or in Europe and so on. To understand the effects of increased trade on income distribution in the European Union, for example, we may want to apply the specific factors for the short-run effects, or the Tech-Schollin model for long-run effects. In spite of the differences in their details, our models share a number of features. Firstly, the productive capacity of an economy can be summarized by its production possibility frontier, and differences in these frontiers give rise to trade. Secondly, production possibilities determine a country's relative supply schedule. And thirdly, world equilibrium is determined by world relative demand and a world relative supply schedule that lies between the national relative supply schedules. Because of these common features, the models we have studied may be viewed as special cases of a more general model of a trading world economy. These are many important issues in international economics whose analysis can be conducted in terms of this general model, with only the details depending on which special model you choose. These issues include the effects of shifts in world supply resulting from economic growth and simultaneous shifts in supply and demand resulting from tariffs and export subsidies. In this lesson, we stress those insights from international trade theory that are not strongly dependent on the details of economic supply side. We develop a standard model of a trading world economy, of which the models of previous lessons can be regarded as special cases and use this model to ask how a variety of changes as underlying parameters affect the world economy. Our learning goals after studying this lesson: you will be able to understand how the components of the standard trade model, production possibilities frontier, ISA-value lines, and indifference curves fit together to illustrate how trade patterns are established by a combination of supply-side and demand-side factors. You will also be able to recognize how changes in the terms of trade and economic growth affect the welfare of nations engaged in international trade. You will be able to understand the effects of tariffs and subsidies on trade patterns and the welfare of trading nations and on the distribution of income within countries. And last but not least, you will be able to relate international borrowing and lending to the standard trade model, where goods are exchanged over time. The standard trade model is built on 4 key relationships. Firstly, the relationship between the production possibility frontier and the relative supply curve. Secondly, the relationship between relative prices and relative demand. Thirdly, the determination of world equilibrium by world relative supply and world relative demand. And the fourth, the effect of the terms of trade, the price of a country's exports divided by the price of its imports on a nation's welfare. So let's go to definitions of key terms. By biased growth, export biased growth means that it expands a country's production possibility in the direction of the good. Import biased growth expands a country's production possibility in the direction of the good. Imports. International trade effects of growth result from the fact that such growth typically has a bias. Biased growth takes place when the production possibility frontier shifts out more in one direction than in other. The other term, export subsidy. Export subsidies consist of all subsidies on goods and services that become payable to resident producers when the goods leave the economic territory or when the services are delivered to non-resident units. They include direct subsidies on exports, losses, government trading enterprises in respect on the trade with non-residents and subsidies resulting from multiple exchange rates. And an example of export subsidy, when this means a government policy to encourage export of goods and discourage sales of goods on the domestic market through direct payments, low-cost loans, tax relief for exporters, or government finance international advertising, then the example could be Saudi Arabia as a net exporter of wheat, Japan often a net exporter of rice, and so on. And how do export subsidies work? You know, they are a form of protectionism. State aid to home producers will shift the domestic supply curve downwards by the extent of the per unit subsidy, thereby allowing firms to lower cost and price and perhaps undercut foreign competition. For example, UK aid to British banks in 2008. External price is an external cost or negative externality. It's a cost that a transaction or activity imposes on a party that is not part of the transaction of activity. In other words, it is cost imposed on a party that can control whether or not the transaction or activity occurs. By production, external cost of production, also known as externalities, refer to the economic concept of uncompensated social or environmental effects. For example, when people buy fuel for a car, they pay for the production of that fuel, an internal cost, but not for the cost of burning that fuel, such as air pollution, external cost. Emissarizing growth occurs if a technological improvement or an increase in the availability of a factor of production makes people more miserable in that it actually decreases the real output of an economy. It is often modeled as occurring because of structural rigidities in a model with international trade. Early exceptions were emissarizing growth at domestic causes come from classical and perhaps Marxist theories, Marx 1863-1883 or David Ricardo 1817. He introduced this possibility in a chapter entitled On Machinery that he added to his last edition of the Properties of Political Economy and Taxation. He provided an example where a technological improvement would reduce equilibrium output in the short run. In the long run, however, a real input would rise. It was written by Hicks in 1969, Samuelson 1988, or Shields 1989. Import tariffs are taxes charged by the customs authority on the importation of goods into a country. Usually the value of the imported goods determines the amount that will be levied on them. In some contexts, import tariffs also means import duties, customs duties, tariffs, or important tax. So the trade indifference curve is the locus of such trade positions which are equally preferred for country, and therefore it is indifferent about them. In other words, a trade indifference curve represents those export-import combinations to which the given country is indifferent. There are different types of indifference curves for normal goods, substitutes, and perfect complements. An internal price places a monetary value on greenhouse gas emissions, which businesses can then factor into investment decisions and business operations. Companies use internal pricing as a strategy to manage climate-related business risk. It is called internal carbon pricing, and also to prepare for a transition to a low-carbon economy. So what is internal carbon pricing? That encourages innovation and sustained economic competitiveness. It also helps companies identify organizational inefficiency that are adding to overall costs. It helps prepare for the forecasted low carbon economy and to increase their own efficiency and market profitability. To sum up, the standard trade model derives a relative supply curve from production possibilities and a relative demand curve from preferences. The price of exports relative to imports and the country's terms of trade is determined by the intersection of the relative supply and demand curves. Other things equal, a rise in a country's terms of trade increases its welfare. Conversely, a decline in a country's terms of trade will leave the country worse off. Economic growth means an outward shift in a country's production possibility frontier. Such growth is usually biased, that is, the production possibility frontier shifts out more in the direction of some goods than in the direction of others. The immediate effect of biased growth is to lead, other things equal, to an increase in the world relative supply of the goods toward which the growth is biased. The shift in the world relative supply curve in turn leads to a change in the growing country's terms of trade, which can go in either direction. If the growing country's terms of trade improve, this improvement reinforces the national growth at home, but hurts the growth in the rest of the world. If the growing country's terms of trade worsen, this decline offsets some of the favorable effects of growth at home, but benefits the rest of the world. The direction of the terms of trade effects depends on the nature of the growth. Growth that is export biased, growth that expands the ability of an economy to produce the goods it was initially exporting more than it expands the economy's ability to produce goods that compete with imports, worsens the terms of trade. Conversely, growth that is import-based, disproportionately increasing the ability to produce import-competing goods, improves a country's terms of trade. It is possible for import-biased growth abroad to hurt a country. Import tariffs and export subsidies affect both relative supply and relative demand. A tariff raises the relative supply of a country's import good while lowering relative demand. A tariff unambiguously improves the country's terms of trade at the rest of the world's expense. An export subsidy has the reverse effect, increasing the relative supply and reducing the relative demand for the country's export goods, and thus worsening the terms of trade. The terms of trade effects of an export subsidy hurt the subsidizing country and benefit the rest of the world, while those of a tariff do the reverse. This suggests that export subsidies do not make sense from a national point of view and that foreign export subsidies should be welcomed rather than countered. Both tariffs and subsidies, however, have strong effects on the distribution of income within countries, and these effects often weigh more heavily on policy than the terms of trade concerns. International borrowing and lending can be viewed as a kind of international trade, but one that involves trade of present consumption for future consumption rather than trade of one good for another. The relative price at which this intertemporal trade takes place is 1 plus the real rate of interest.
At the end, there is just to say subscribe and give me likes. See you soon!